To remove the motor, you'll need the following tools. You'll need a hex key wrench set, chain breakers, crank arm puller, and a 16-notch bottom bracket tool. Start by removing the battery. Then remove the rear chain guide. Remove tension from the chain system and derail the chain from the rear driving cog. Rotate the chain in circulation until you find the quick link in the chain. Use the chain breakers to break the quick link, thereby separating the chain. Make sure you keep the quick links and it doesn't get lost. Cycle the chain through the system and remove it completely. Then remove the left non-drive side crank arm bolt using a 10mm X-wrench. Then use the crank arm puller to remove the crank arm itself. The outer thread threads into the crank arm itself, and then the inner thread drives onto the spindle to remove the crank arm. Remove the spacers for the bottom bracket. Use a 3mm X-wrench to remove the pinch bolt on the retaining collar. The retaining collar will then unthread from the spindle, freeing up the spindle for removal. Lightly tap on the spindle with a rubber mallet to remove completely. Use the 16-notch bottom bracket tool to undo the bottom bracket cup on the non-drive side. You can remove it completely. Then remove the motor drive chain cover in order to remove the bottom bracket chainring assembly completely. Use a hex wrench to relieve some load from the spring load mechanism. Wiggle on the chainring until it is removed from the bottom bracket. Move the torque sensor wire from the thin slot round all the way to the circular hole where the cable can be completely removed. Pull on the cable to remove from the plug. Make sure to keep the silver shim on the drive side behind the sprockets. Finally, there are 6 screws located left and right of the motor, securing it to the bike. These can be undone to drop the motor from the bike. Before removing all the screws, make sure the motor electrical wires are decoupled from the bike. To do this, you will need to access the wires from the top cover plate underneath the battery. There are 4 M4 screws holding the plate in place. You can use a 2.5mm X-wrench to undo these screws. After the screws are undone, the plate can be removed and the wires will be revealed. All the visible connecting wires can be decoupled, as they can just be plugged in later on, and it could be confusing to analyze which ones to unplug and which ones not to unplug. For the motor itself, there's a battery wire, a main harness, and a speed sensor wire. After the motor is decoupled electrically from the bike, the final screws can be removed and the motor will drop down out of the bike. To reinstall the motor, the wires will need to be fed through into the bike coming out the top where we remove the cover plate for the wires. Make sure the torque sensor wire is fed through the circular hole on the side plate as to not pinch it when you reinstall the motor. When the motor is in place, line up 1 or 2 screws to hold the motor in place while the other screws can be installed. Do not fully tighten one screw by one screw. Make sure all 6 screws are installed by hand, and then you can tighten each one individually. By doing this, you will make sure it's much easier to line up the screws and ensures that the screws will not be stripped into the bike. To make sure the screws are installed correctly, torque them to the correct spec if a torque wrench is available to you. To reinstall the sprockets and freewheel, you'll have to connect the torque sensor first. Connect the torque sensor wire, feed it back into the circular hole, and fish the wire around the hook where it can feed into the motor at a better angle once the unit is fully installed. Feed the wire in as you put the chainring closer to the bike. Remember to add the silver shim behind the chainring. Add the golden motor drive chain. First, make sure the chain aligns with the largest sprocket. Then align it with the smallest sprocket. You can use a tool to de-stress the tensioner to make sure it's much easier to install the torque sensor and chain wheel itself. After the chain wheel is partially installed, make sure that the wire is fed into the correct location as you install the chain wheel. The correct placement of this wire is vital that it is not damaged during the use of the bike. You can reinstall the BB cup with the 7mm spacer attached. Make sure the tensioner and chain guide is in the correct position. You will feel it locate on a flat spot between the chain guide and the plate. Afterwards, use a 16-notch bottom bracket tool to tighten to the correct torque. Reinstall the spindle. Add the retaining collar. Tighten by hand only. Do not over-tighten the preload collar, as it will over-tension the spindle into the bottom bracket and decrease bearing life. After the collar is tightened by hand, use a 3mm hex wrench to fully tighten the collar to the spindle, making sure it's pitched. Add the spindle spacers previously removed and reinstall the crank arm. To make sure the crank arm is correctly installed, make sure it pushes up against the spindle spacers until the crank fully bottoms out. Reinstall the chain cover. Reconnect the wires into the correct position. All the wires can only be connected into one way, as they all have their own matching connectors. Make sure the connectors are lined up correctly with indicating arrows in order to not damage them. Make sure all the peripheral wires are at the bottom and then finally put the battery wires on top. After all the wires are filled into the pocket of the bike, you can add the cover for the wires again. Reinstall the battery. Reinstall the chain. Before adding the chain on the rear sprocket, let it hang just right of the sprocket. Feed it through the chain guide first. You will notice there's a narrow wide profile on the chain. Make sure the chain meshes on the chain ring first properly. Then continue feeding it through the system. There are different ways of installing the chain. Each method works better for individuals. You can try your own method or follow the method I'm using at the moment. After feeding the chain through the bike system, you can reconnect the quick link. Make sure it pops back into place using the chain breakers. De-stress the tensioner and add it back onto the rear driving cog. Add Loctite on the derailleur hanger threads and reinstall the rear chain guide.